That version of the story is true in its essentials. Roy Lee Dennis, known to everyone who loved him as Rocky, did live with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a condition so rare that when he was diagnosed in the mid-1960s, fewer than 10 cases had ever been recorded in all of medical history. He did outlive by nearly a decade the death sentence the doctors delivered when he was 2 years old. He did grow into a young man of remarkable warmth and intelligence and humor who left an impression on everyone he encountered that had nothing to do with how he looked and everything to do with who he was. And his mother, Florence Rusty Tullis, did fight for him with a ferocity and a completeness that no institution, no medical authority, and no social convention was able to diminish. But before Rusty died in November 2006, she talked. She gave interviews. She sat with reporters and spoke with the directness and the bluntness that had characterized everything she had ever done in her life, and what she said about Rocky, about the movie that made their story famous, about the night her son died, and about the things that Hollywood had smoothed and altered and simply left out of the version it chose to tell, was more complicated and more honest, and in some ways considerably more difficult than the film ever allowed itself to be. What Rusty Dennis said before she died is the story that most people who watched Mask in 1985 never heard. And once you hear it, the story you thought you knew looks genuinely different. To understand what Rusty said and why it carries the weight it does, you need to understand who Rusty actually was, which is to say you need to set aside the Cher version, however brilliant, and look at the real woman underneath it. Florence Tullis was born in Brooklyn, New York, on May 29, 1936. Her father was a truck driver. She was Jewish, Brooklyn-raised, and sharp in a way that formal education could not contain and would not have known what to do with even if it had tried. She was kicked out of junior high school for truancy before she was old enough to be a teenager in any meaningful sense of the word. By the time she was 14, she was smoking marijuana and running with motorcycle gangs. At 15, she dropped out of school entirely. She found work as a dancer at Coney Island. She was not, at that point in her life, old enough to hold a driver's license. She married young, to a truck driver named Tommy Mason, and had a son named Joshua. That marriage ended and Rusty moved back to her parents. She married again, this time to a man named Roy Dennis, and the couple moved to California. In 1961, in Glendora, Roy Lee Dennis arrived. He was nicknamed Rocky almost immediately, because as an infant he would not sleep unless someone rocked him. He was Rusty's second son, and he would become the center of a story that nobody who knew either of them could have fully predicted or prepared for. The early signs were easy to overlook. Rocky had frequent ear infections and sinus problems as a very small child. He was a sickly kid, but not unusually so, not in ways that suggested anything beyond ordinary childhood vulnerability to illness. Then, around the age of 2, he went in for a routine tonsillectomy. The X-ray technologist who examined him noticed something wrong with the structure of his skull. What followed was the beginning of an odyssey through the medical system that would define the rest of Rocky's life and the rest of Rusty's along with it. After nearly a year of visits to UCLA Medical Center, multiple times every week, the diagnosis came through: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a condition in which abnormal calcium deposits accumulate continuously in the skull, causing the bones to thicken and grow and press outward, distorting the face progressively, compressing the brain, destroying vision and hearing and neurological function in a process that is slow and relentless and, in 1965, entirely without treatment. The doctors told Rusty that her son would be blind, almost certainly intellectually disabled, and dead before his 7th birthday. Rusty's response to this information was the first indication of exactly who she was and what she was made of. She did not accept the timeline. She did not accept the prognosis in the spirit in which it was delivered, as a fact about the future rather than a prediction about what was likely. She had built her entire personal philosophy around a single conviction that she had arrived at independently, and that she held with a kind of absolute certainty that cannot be argued with and cannot be dislodged by medical authority or social pressure. She believed that the human body could be directed by the human mind. If a person could make themselves sick, they could also make themselves well. She had decided this early in her life, and she had lived by it, and she raised Rocky on it without apology or qualification. The world Rocky Dennis entered as a school-age child was not a gentle one for someone who looked the way he looked. Craniodiaphyseal dysplasia created a physical appearance that was dramatically and immediately different from anyone around him, the kind of difference that children, who are not born with cruelty but can learn it very quickly from the world they inhabit, responded to with the full and unfiltered brutality that unguided childhood can produce. Rocky knew what it was to be stared at and to be the subject of reactions that had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with how he appeared. He understood this reality from a very young age, and he navigated it with a grace and a humor and a fundamental genius. Rusty fought the institutions that tried to limit her son with the same energy and the same refusal to accept their framing that she had brought to the doctor's prognosis. Schools in Covina and Glendora attempted to move Rocky out of mainstream classes, citing his visual impairment and the general assessment of what a child with his condition could reasonably be expected to achieve academically. Rusty dismantled those assessments in every forum available to her. She told People magazine in the years following Rocky's death that she believed the resistance she encountered from schools was not fundamentally about Rocky's capacity, which she had always understood to be fully intact, but about the discomfort his presence created for other parents and for teachers who had not encountered anything like him and did not know how to respond. She fought. And Rocky proved her right. He graduated from Sandberg Junior High as an honor student, having started from a position of significant academic disadvantage. He was elected best buddy by his classmates. He was voted most good-natured and friendliest camper. He tutored other students for $3 an hour, a rate he negotiated himself. He memorized the night sky. He fell in love at a summer camp with a girl who was blind and who could not see his face and who saw, as a result, everything about him that mattered. When doctors proposed surgery that might alter his facial features, Rocky asked them a single question. He asked who he would see in the mirror if they changed his face. He chose his face. He chose to remain himself. The circle that surrounded Rocky was as unconventional as his mother. Rusty was a full member of a motorcycle gang called the Turks, and these were not the recreational bikers of the suburban imagination. They were rough and hard-living and bluntly loyal, and they loved Rocky without qualification or condition. The man the film called Gar, played by Sam Elliott with the kind of quiet authority the role required, was based on Rusty's real partner Bernie Tullis, and the biker community that surrounded Rocky's childhood and adolescence was not dramatic backdrop. It was his family, as genuine and as committed as any family can be, formed by choice and loyalty rather than biology. By the time Mask reached American movie theaters in 1985, Rocky Dennis had been dead for 7 years. He had died at home, in his sleep, on October 3, 1978. He was 16 years old, nearly 17. He had outlived his doctor's timeline by almost a decade. The disease that should have ended his life before his 7th birthday had been beaten back. Through what combination of Rusty's philosophy and Rocky's own spirit and simple biological unpredictability, no one can say with certainty. Across years of headaches and declining vision, and the relentless forward march of the calcium deposits in his skull that no belief system could ultimately halt. The movie that Peter Bogdanovich made about Rocky and Rusty grossed more than $48 million at the box office. It earned Cher a Golden Globe. It made the story of a family that had lived mostly beneath the radar of public attention into one of the most discussed films of its year. And it paid Florence Rusty Tullis $15,000 for the rights to her son's life and her own. $15,000 against $48 million. That number sat in the public record without anyone making particularly much of it, but Rusty made something of it. She was characteristically direct about where the money went. Most of it, by her own account and by the accounts of those who knew her situation at the time, went to medical bills for Joshua, her older son, who had by 1985 been diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, the cancer closely associated with AIDS that was devastating the gay community in America with a speed and a lethality that the medical and political establishment was responding to with unconscionable slowness. Rusty had not sold Rocky's story for profit. She had sold it to try to keep Joshua alive. She sold one son's story to try to save the other. Joshua died in 1987 at 32 years old. Rusty had now lost both sons. When reporters arrived expecting the kind of grateful, tearful Hollywood validation that the movie seemed to invite, Rusty gave them something else entirely. She gave them her actual opinion. She called Mask a fairy tale. Those were her words, used plainly and without apparent concern for how they might be received by the studio or the director or anyone else with an interest in the film's legacy. She acknowledged that it contained emotional truth. She praised Cher's performance with the kind of genuine specificity that makes it clear she was not simply being polite. She told the Chicago Tribune in 1986 that she had depicted the way she was very well, and she added, with the particular Rusty Dennis brand of self-awareness that managed to be both sharp and completely without vanity, that she had always thought she was perfectly normal and that the rest of the world was nuts. That observation, offered in the context of a woman reflecting on seeing herself portrayed on screen, is as precise and as revealing a piece of self-description as anything she ever said publicly. She did not experience herself as unconventional. She experienced herself as clear-eyed about a world that had its own significant peculiarities. Her primary complaint about the film was not about how she was portrayed, but about what was missing. Joshua was not in Mask at all. A real person who was central to Rusty's life, who was Rocky's older brother, who was present during the years the film depicted and who was very much alive when the events it dramatized took place, had been written out of the story entirely. Then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen. This was not a casual preference. It was a genuine and deep connection to an artist whose music meant something specific and important to a young man navigating a life that required the kind of defiant hopefulness that Springsteen's songs had always been particularly good at expressing. Director Peter Bogdanovich understood this and built the film's original soundtrack around Springsteen's music. Then Universal Pictures, unable to reach a licensing agreement with Springsteen's record label, quietly replaced the entire soundtrack with songs by Bob Seger without informing Bogdanovich. Rusty appeared on a San Francisco talk show in 1985 and addressed this directly. She said flatly that she did not think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. 5 words: devastating, precise, and completely sufficient. Bogdanovich was so furious about the music substitution that he sued Universal for $19 million, claiming the change violated his rights as director. The Springsteen songs were eventually restored for a director's cut release in 2004, 2 decades after the film had first reached audiences. But the thing Rusty said before she died that carries more weight than any of her observations about the film, the thing that lands differently from everything else because it connects directly to the night Rocky actually died, is about what happened and what did not happen and the gap between them. The movie shows Rusty discovering her son's body herself, a scene of raw and specific grief that is one of the film's most emotionally powerful moments. The reality was different. On the night of October 2, 1978, Rocky came home from a family dinner at a restaurant with a headache. He was in a wheelchair by then, weakened by the accumulated progression of a disease that had been fighting him for his entire life and that was finally, after nearly 17 years, beginning to win. The headaches had escalated to a severity that nothing could adequately address. Rusty did what she had always done throughout Rocky's entire life when he was in pain. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. He died in his sleep. He was found the following morning. At the time Rocky died, Rusty was not at home. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner Bernie called to tell her. The movie placed her at Rocky's side for the discovery of his death because that is the dramatically coherent version of events, the version that allows the audience to be with the mother in the moment of her most complete loss. The reality was more jagged, more like actual life, which does not arrange its most devastating moments around the principles of dramatic unity. What Rusty said about her parenting philosophy in the context of Rocky's death is the most complex and the most difficult part of what she left in the record. She never described the instruction to go to his room and make himself well as a mistake. She never framed it as something she regretted or would have done differently. She had told Rocky to do exactly that throughout his entire life. Every headache, every flare of pain, every moment when the disease made its presence felt in his body, was met with the same response from his mother. The philosophy was not cruelty. It was the deepest expression of what Rusty believed about the relationship between mind and body, and what she believed Rocky needed to hear from her above all else was that she would not treat him as someone who was dying. She had always promised him that. She kept the promise to the end. Whether that philosophy also meant that Rocky's pain was sometimes met with responses that a different kind of parent might have handled differently is a question that only Rocky and Rusty could have fully answered. What the record shows is that Rusty never backed away from it, never apologized for it, and never suggested that she believed it had failed him. She believed it had given him the only thing that truly mattered, which was the refusal to see himself as a victim of his own condition. He had lived not as a dying boy, but as a living one, and that, in Rusty's understanding of what she owed her son, was the greatest gift she could have given him. After Rocky's death, Rusty moved to San Francisco and took up Buddhism. She became a counselor working with people struggling with drug addiction, channeling her own complicated history with substances into something that could genuinely help people who were where she had been. She had plans to work with the Shanti Project, an organization that provided support to terminally ill patients, including those dying of AIDS during the epidemic that was reshaping San Francisco's character in the early 1980s. The woman who had once seemed to be defined entirely by chaos was, by the middle of that decade, building something quieter and more purposeful. She was still riding motorcycles. That part never changed. On October 14, 2006, Florence Rusty Tullis was riding her three-wheel motorcycle when the right tire came off the vehicle. She lost control. The bike struck a curb. She was thrown into a telephone pole. She was 70 years old. Nobody knew what had happened to her for some time after the accident, until a brief item in a local newspaper mentioned an unidentified elderly woman injured in a motorcycle accident, and people who knew her connected the description to Rusty and went to find her. She had broken both legs. She had a punctured lung. She survived the accident itself, because she was Rusty Dennis, and surviving things was the organizing principle of her entire existence. But the infection that followed was the thing her body could not fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006,